This is a response to PPSimmons' video, "There's something very fishy about evolution. I can smell it from here. Carl Gallups explains." Carl. I know it's been a while, but as the preacher said to the prostitute, and I'm sure you'll agree, better late than never. Now, you may have noticed your rectum regaining some of its former elasticity during my prolonged absence, and for that you have my sincerest apologies. In addition, my unavoidable hiatus has unfortunately resulted in me breaking my promise to you with regard to reintroducing every one of your anti-evolutionary arguments to your anus as you expelled them. Since I like to pride myself as being a man of my word, this sorely pains me, but because my channel isn't underwritten by a cabal of shady rich fucks who evidently have far more money than sense, I have to spend some of my time making an honest living. I do this because, unlike you, my conscience won't allow me to take the easy route by fleecing gullible simpletons out of their hard-earned cash by lying to them like the Pope at an AIDS prevention workshop, and also, unlike you, I'd prefer to be a productive member of society rather than a leech sucking on its arse for all it's worth. Of course, once I found my time freeing up and then attended to some pressing matters that needed to be dealt with by the knee-deep insertion of my right boot, the first thing I had in mind was to catch up with old friends, and so I headed off to the PPSimmons channel. And since your somewhat voluminous output will prohibit me from living up to my previous pledge, I decided to select your most recent crime against reason and carry on where I left off. I was therefore gratified to see that things hadn't changed at all while I was away, because the appallingly punctuated title of this particularly offensive offering gave me a pretty good idea of what was in store for me. That title was also a great source of mirth, not only because it's hard to imagine you being capable of explaining the facts of life to a porn star, let alone the intricacies of evolutionary biology to anyone else, but also because the fishy redolence you claim to perceive around the theory of evolution is but a bagatelle compared to the horrifically foul stench emanating from your video. A stench that was most certainly not Piscean in origin, but rather more reminiscent of the arse end of a decomposing skunk that had passed away from an acute episode of explosive diarrhea. So with all that said, let's get onto your video and see exactly how you managed to excrete such a noxious reek without using your anal sphincter in the way nature intended.
How does the salmon find its way from the mammoth-sized ocean to the same little teeny stream, sometimes many hundreds of miles away, to the exact same spawning ground of its birth? Some scientists have long theorized that the fish use a sort of compass system. However, until recently, this supposed compass system had eluded the researchers, but now they have finally found it.
Okay, Carl, let's stop it here. The first thing that struck me after recovering from the temporary bout of dyspepsia induced by my reintroduction to the nauseatingly smug cadence of your voice was that you appeared to be completely unaware of the irony positively dripping from this clip. And that is that you seem to be preparing the ground for your inevitable litany of lies by relying on a crucial part of the scientific method. That is the prediction of phenomena by theory and the subsequent confirmation of said theory by observation of said phenomena. That, Carl, is the same process that's been used countless times over the past 150 years to confirm in broad terms the validity of the theory of evolution beyond any reasonable doubt to all but the most mentally deficient, undereducated baboons. From Crick-Brenner and others' evolutionarily motivated prediction of the universality of the genetic code to Zuckerkandl and Pauling's stunningly prescient hypothesis that forthcoming molecular sequence data would mirror traditional taxonomic trees, from Darwin's contention that mankind first evolved in Africa that was later beautifully corroborated by a dizzying myriad of fossil hominids to Neil Shubin's discovery of Tiktaalik exactly where he'd envisaged, and from the molecular confirmation of the anatomical evidence that suggested that cetaceans are most closely related to ungulates to the use of evolutionary algorithms to successfully predict the epidemiology of virus propagation. So it's kind of rich, Carl, to watch you preparing to use this discovery of science to smear your mental feces over another aspect of equally accepted science solely because the latter roughly rogers your cherished but demonstrably erroneous beliefs up the jacksie while the former does not. From this kind of intellectually dishonest cherry-picking, I think it's quite clear exactly how much you care about the truth of the reality we actually occupy over your insistence of clinging to the fables and legends of ignorant and barbaric bygone desert nomads.
The salmon compasses were hard to find because they are so small. Individual cells contain microscopic clusters of magnetite crystals, the same mineral used in man-made handheld compasses.
I think I can see where you're going with this already, Carl, because the supposed arguments you generally make are so fucking simple-minded that even an intellectually stunted gibbon with a severe learning disability could follow them. As a result, I'm going to leave out your subsequent minute-long soliloquy about the intricacy of this magnetosensory system, since it's already pretty obvious to anyone who's familiar with the predictability of creationist mantra that you're about to use it to construct one of your specialities. That is a colossal argument from your own seemingly endless ignorance.
Could anyone argue that a fully functional compass, complete with a spinning needle, could ever be arranged by evolutionary happenstance without intelligent input?
And there it is, Carl, the inevitable argument from the ignorance of the deliberately ignorant fucktard. I'm sorry, Carl, but you're going to have to excuse me if I decline to take this kind of argumentation seriously, because it's been stuffed up the collective rector of so many creationists so many times that the patina of shite it's accumulated is thicker than the entire faculty of Liberty University. You see, Carl, it turns out it's actually quite difficult to try and understand and explain natural phenomena at the level we're now at, which is why it's somewhat unusual to find valuable contributions in such areas from dim-witted dipshits like you. On the other hand, it turns out it's laughably easy to sit on your arse in a pew in the celestial emporium of your choosing and go through an almost infinite number of complex biological systems that scientists, and notably not doltish imbeciles of your ilk, have discovered, and smugly proclaim that they cannot be explained in any other way than by invoking mystical incantations from ephemeral transcendent spectres. That's why history is positively replete with examples of tards like you filling the gaps in our knowledge with their preferred choice of imperceptible prestidigitator, and then subsequently being proven by their infinite superiors to be full of the proverbial brown substance. So if you'd like to do a little better than follow their ignominious footsteps, you'd be well advised to reconsider your approach, and rather than proffering arguments worthy of a kindergartner, perhaps provide some indication as to why those gaps aren't being filled by nothing more than your wishful thinking. Of course, I realize that your audience probably puts as much thought into these matters as you do, and so take your preposterous pronouncements at face value, but if enough rationalists keep pointing out the horrendous smell emanating from your channel, they may eventually come to recognize it for what it is and see where it's coming from. So when it comes to people like me, Carl, until you can provide empirical evidence of either the spectre of your preference or the mechanisms that it employed in breaking the laws of physics in order to achieve the state of affairs that you assert have come to pass, I and people like me will continue to look at your argument and smell it for what it really is. So in the end, it seems you're taking the same approach you've taken countless times before, just with a different biological phenomenon. So I can only assume that you and your fellow simians at the PPSimmons channel might be running out of ideas.
Well, of course, the evolutionist says this very thing. But then again, they have to. The same evolution scientist would never admit that a compass as you and I know one could ever, in a billion years, arrange itself without intelligent input into a fully functioning tool. But that same scientist will declare that an internal compass made of the same magnetized components, fully functioning with complex chemical components as well, not yet duplicated by man himself, did arrange itself and began guiding salmon in their hundreds of miles of journeys through non-purposed evolution.
Well, it seems I was right, Carl, because it looks like you're shaking out the same tired old threadbare argument that you've flown so proudly above the crumbling ruins of your primitive doctrines before, blown off the dust and moths, crudely daubed on a new logo, and are now proudly waving it above your head like a simpleton who truly believes that he's saying something new. So although I'm sure you already know why compasses don't assemble themselves spontaneously, Carl, it looks like I'm going to have to explain it again. I would like to point out, though, that this complete cowpat of an argument has been flushed so many times before that you and any other creationist should be ashamed of yourselves for continuing to crap it out as if it were anything other than the turd it is. In fact, the intellectual dishonesty of your perpetuating it is so vast that it's in danger of eclipsing Joel Osteen's bank account, because the honest thing to do would be to acknowledge the refutation and argue against that, rather than spraying a new coat of falsehood onto the same floater and presenting it as if it was something new. Of course, it seems that either because of your severe mental incapacity or your vile and quite repugnant dishonesty, you're incapable of doing this, and so instead settle for ignoring the answers that have been given and continuing to lie like a priest in the choir boy's changing room. So for the upteenth time, Carl, regardless of your incredulity born of your deliberate and seemingly limitless ignorance, the reason that these scientists will on one hand assert that compasses don't appear from nowhere, whereas on the other they agree that biological magnetosensors most likely evolved from simpler and perhaps functionally unrelated precursors, is that it's currently widely accepted that compasses do not reproduce themselves with variation. This consensus has come about both because of the observation that compasses are assembled by human beings using known laws of physics, and also because to date no zoologist has come across two compasses fucking like rabbits.
The hypocrisy and duplicity of evolution declaration is embarrassing.
Is it now, Carl? So how would you characterize the behavior I just elaborated on? How about morally bankrupt shitbaggery? If I were you, I wouldn't be embarrassed for the scientists, but rather for your God, whose standards for his worshippers are apparently slacker than Kent Hovine's anus after lights out. The perceived hypocrisy you're appealing to doesn't in fact exist because, as I mentioned earlier, these scientists have good reasons, based on readily observable natural processes and verifiable evidence, that life, and so by extension salmon magnetosensors, evolved. If you have empirical evidence that in this case they might have arisen with the help of some magic words and a sprinkling of pixie dust, then you'd be better off presenting that than your inept hand-waving. But of course, in reality, you have no such evidence, and so resort to all you have left in order to preserve your cherished delusion that an inbred cadre of primitive savages knew more about the natural world than we do. Unfortunately for you, Carl, while these nomads might have much to teach us about the intricacies involved in the anal molestation of assorted domesticated ungulates, I have to inform you that the sum of the knowledge they have to impart in the areas of the physical sciences is and always has been exactly and precisely sweet fuck all.
Non-intelligent appearances of compass mechanisms in salmon and other living creatures is, as always, an assertion based on a pre-existing pseudoscientific commitment to evolution.
So having reintroduced us to those two old stalwarts of yours, the arguments from ignorance and personal incredulity, you now switch gears and ease effortlessly into another one of your favourite standbys, the psychological projection of your own dogmatic zealotry onto scientists. Perhaps this confusion arose because your knowledge of the history of science is comparable to your knowledge of its contents, because it seems that you're unaware that this pre-existing commitment hasn't always existed. Just 300 years ago, Carl, almost everyone, including early scientists, was in your camp, and young Earth creationism was the only game in town. It was only in the 19th century, with the work of pioneers such as Buckland, Sedgwick and Lyell, that things began to change and the age of the Earth was slowly pushed back way past the limits of your simplistic fables. But this sea change wasn't due to some dramatic groundswell of militant atheism, Carl. It was due to the inevitable synthesis of the collected data which was arrived at by honest and brilliant men who cared more about the truth and their religious beliefs, and who were able to find ways to accommodate those beliefs into the new and spectacular view of reality. So this assertion you speak of, Carl, isn't based on some kind of atheistic dogma as you like to imply, It's based on a mountain of essentially irrefutable evidence that's been accumulating for over a century and that smothered your ludicrously infantile alternative a long, long time ago. And by the way, while you might wishfully think that everyone will take your word for it when you dismiss this evidence by pathetically slapping the label of pseudoscience on it, I'm afraid the only people you're convincing are the poor saps whose minds are already irrevocably shackled to your toxic dogmata. That's because when an incompetent boob struts out into public and pompously proclaims that he knows better than all the established experts in fields in which he has zero training and even less competence, then the only response is hail and hearty laughter. And when the same boob discloses that he bases his ignorant opposition because he prefers to believe in legendary fantasies of long-dead tribal shamans, well, the laughter becomes deafening.
In fact, the assertion that compasses evolved, which means they constructed themselves piece by piece without intelligent input, ignores the fact that the irreducible core compass structure cannot be reduced or amended without destroying its function. The crystals, the cell placement, the cell-to-cell sense receptors, and the means to communicate the magnoreceptor data to the brain for processing must all exist at the same time for the compass mechanism to properly work.
Again, you parrot the same old discredited arguments as if they're something fresh and new rather than tired and tatty rags that have been ripped to shreds countless times in the past. As a result, I'm going to gloss over the details because quite frankly, Carl, it's quite clear you're completely uninterested in finding anything even vaguely resembling the truth. Instead, I'll point everyone else watching this in the direction of 3 outstanding videos by CDK007 on the subject and restrict myself to saying this. Irreducible complexity is not a description of the history of a system, it's a feature of its current state with regard to its current functions. So just because a system's current function can be easily disrupted doesn't mean that in the past the components that were co-opted in its evolution were not either partially useful or utilized in other ways. It also doesn't mean that each step didn't produce suboptimal and perhaps unrelated functions that nevertheless conferred a selective advantage that could subsequently be built on. And it certainly doesn't mean that these systems didn't become more and more complex, interdependent and specialized and that they didn't become more sensitive to disruption. You may not have noticed, Carl, but there are a lot more ways to fuck up a grandfather clock than there are an hourglass. This general principle has been demonstrated time and time again for other better characterized systems, including past creationist favorites such as the eye, the bacterial flagellum, the bombardier beetle, and the immune system, each of which was smugly claimed to be irreducibly complex and therefore unevolvable by a string of lobotomized fucktards who subsequently and with short shrift had these claims stuffed roughly up their tailpipes by people who actually knew what they were talking about. Of course, these previous rebuttals have done nothing to dampen the ardor of dishonest jizzbags like you for this complete arse-splat of an argument whenever you're introduced to a new complex biological system, and instead of pausing for thought at the utter failure of your previous attempts, you pounce onto it like dung beetles into a freshly laid turd and trot out the same old arguments as if you're actually saying something new. It's so easy for you, isn't it, Carl? Because at the end of the day, it turns out that it's far, far simpler to just make shit up than it is to debunk it, since it requires absolutely no thought or effort on the part of the dumb fuck who has an almost infinite selection of complex phenomena at his disposal, while it takes a great deal of effort for the rationalist who has to shovel away the seemingly endless avalanche of fecal brain bilge.
Without the compass, the salmon species could not reproduce. The instant appearance of this required piece of brilliant and necessary equipment required a master engineer. Good thing for the salmon that God really does exist.
Once again, Carl, while extant salmon with their extant behavior may find it difficult to reproduce without the aid of magnetoreception, it doesn't follow that their ancestors did, since there's no reason to believe that their earlier migratory patterns using cruder magnetoreceptors were the same as the ones they exhibit today. But since this is still a relatively new area of study and researchers have only just begun to tease out the molecular and cellular mechanisms that underlie these phenomena, let alone their evolution, The most likely steps in this process have yet to be elucidated. Of course, for them, this provides a wonderful opportunity to learn more about the natural world, while for dishonest crapstains like you, it provides a wonderful opportunity to do what you do best, and that's to lie like Jesus's personal injury lawyer. So while you might pompously point to this gap in our knowledge and claim victory for your spurious claim, Carl, allow me to disagree. You see, the reason that sane people accept that this cellular system evolved is that they view it from the ramparts of the essentially unassailable citadel built from carefully collected and scrutinized empirical evidence that demonstrates that evolution is a physical reality governed by readily observable physical processes, and that similar irreducibly complex systems have been demonstrated to be evolvable by those processes. Furthermore, your contrary assertion that magnetoreception was intelligently designed and created de novo by an ephemeral entity with a preference for primitive savages over enlightened human beings is somewhat roughly rogered from behind by the observation that birds appear to have developed an entirely different mechanism utilizing the optical generation of radical pairs. Not only does this somewhat knacker that other piece of ID doggerel, that is common design, common designer, it also begs the question as to why this perfect designer couldn't come up with a mechanism that would be universally applicable. As it happens, such diverse solutions to the same problem are beautifully explained by convergent evolution, while the best I've ever seen your flavor of buffoon manage is to claim that the designer must have had a reason while appealing to its ever-ephemeral, mysterious ways. But while those ways appear to be sufficient to explain essentially everything to thought-averse troglodytes like you, Carl, to those of us who prefer to use our brains for more than preventing lint from accumulating in our cranial cavities, they explain nothing more than absolutely bugger all. All in all, this is why people who've been educated in these areas and whose minds haven't been crippled by the palsy of creationism don't jump to the conclusion that magnetoreceptors or other complex biological systems appeared instantly, because they have absolutely no reason to. In contrast, you and your fellow mentally castrated simians throw out your spurious claims with no evidence at all and expect to be treated with the same respect accorded to those who actually have some evidence to back up their conjectures and who have made the effort to think long and hard about these matters. Well, that respect won't be forthcoming from me, Carl, unless you decide to take a break from making your shitty videos and use the time to find some actual evidence for the spontaneous poofing into existence of anything other than the repulsive brain farts that continue to bubble up from the PPSimmons channel. Of course, I doubt that such evidence would be forthcoming no matter how hard you tried, because despite the intense scrutiny of countless individuals over centuries, we still have no evidence that such mystical poofing has ever occurred. And lest you be tempted to set out on this almost certainly futile quest, Carl, perhaps you should consider this. If a God does indeed exist, it seems that it has chosen to create a physical universe of matter, energy, and forces that behave in reliably predictable ways and that can be understood by the minds of human beings. From the behavior of stars and galaxies to that of atoms and molecules, it appears that this God has constructed an autonomous creation that requires no intervention on its part. Furthermore, all the evidence we've accumulated overwhelmingly indicates that the diversification of life is no exception and can also be beautifully explained using the same mechanical processes that cause suns to shine, rain to fall, and winds to blow. So the question to you, Carl, is if this God didn't feel the need to break the physical laws he created every time a star goes nova, every time lightning strikes, and every time a twister forms, why on earth would he forego the same mechanisms in the generation of biological diversity and resort to gaudy magic tricks fit for the deity of a tribe of savages? Is it because generating a world in which evolution could occur would be beyond its powers, Carl? Or would it be easier to explain this discrepancy because some people are just too stupid to understand the natural world and find it much, much easier to put it all down to magic like ignorant savages used to? So if that God does exist, it seems to me, despite whatever reasons you have for clinging to your clearly erroneous and superstitious mumbo-jumbo, all you're doing is spitting in its face and demeaning the stupendous creative vision of an entity that has produced a universe that uses remarkably simple laws to generate the bewildering complexity of this vast and astonishingly beautiful universe we find ourselves in. And if I were that god, Carl, I can assure you that I'd be far from happy with you and your fellow mental defectives who seem to be so insistent on doing nothing other than insulting me.